Welcome everybody, good afternoon, and I'm really delighted to be hosting this session today in celebration of Father's Day next Sunday, and we're just at the end of Carers Week. And for anyone who hasn't met me before, I am Rachel Vecht. I'm a former primary school teacher, I'm a mother of 4, and coming up to 22 years ago, my eldest child is 22 next week, I founded Educating Matters to support the well-being of employees with a specific focus on working parents. But over time, we've got a whole range of experts who support with lots of different topics like neurodiversity, LGBTQ+, allyship, mental fitness, female health, carers, all sorts of things. And it was around 15 years ago that a US law firm specifically asked me to deliver a talk for their employees who were fathers around the role of how a father was evolving. And in that time, I've had the opportunity to engage with tens of thousands of dads globally. And the situation has improved a lot since I first started working in this space, when DEI and wellbeing was not even part of a job title, and there was no such thing as an employee network. However, there is still quite a lot of organizational barriers at work and in the home. And I have been saying for years, as loudly as I can, that we need to move away from regarding mums as primary carers and dads as secondary, to normalize parenting out loud, to enable extended leave for fathers and the possibility of everyone working more flexibly. And I've had the privilege over the years to invite lots of different fascinating dads to do talks like this. But I've never had one who has dedicated an entire book to the topic of equal parenting. And I am really excited to welcome Paul Morgan-Bentley, the author of this fabulous book. So Paul, can you start by sharing just a bit of your personal story and your background to writing The Equal Parent?
Yeah, sure. So I am a journalist. I'm head of investigations at the Times newspaper. I'm also a dad to Solly, who's 3 years old. And I never kind of massively intended to write this kind of book, but when I became a dad, so my husband Robin and I had Solly through surrogacy in the UK, and we absolutely kind of expected that being gay dads would be really central to our experience, that we might, steeled ourselves for maybe facing some kind of homophobia or being treated differently and stuff like that. But actually what happened and what really surprised us in a way was that being gay dads wasn't that formative. Actually, having a baby can be a real leveler. We found quite quickly we were just doing pretty much exactly the same stuff as all our friends. Obviously we weren't breastfeeding, there are some kind of physical differences, but fundamentally, lots of women don't breastfeed as well. And fundamentally, the experience was very similar. However, we kept experiencing this really low expectation of fathers generally, gay or otherwise. And we're really surprised by that, probably naively, but also it was just a big shock. I think we'd both throughout our 20s been in kind of corporate environments where it's very easy at that stage in your life to fool yourself that we're getting much better when it comes to gender equality. And you look around the floor at work and you think, look, there's loads of women doing brilliantly, just as well as the men, lots of senior, all this kind of stuff. But you have a baby and you are transported to this much more old-fashioned existence where every appointment, the expectation is that a mother will be there, not a father. And if you arrive as a dad, you get a huge amount of praise. We kept being praised for every vaccination appointment. A nurse would say something like, oh, it's brilliant to see a dad here, which was lovely, but also really reinforced to us that idea that, the kind of where's mummy thing, this idea that, we expect gender equality at work, but it doesn't work after parenthood if we don't expect it at home. So that's within the home, but also workplaces and also society at large, NHS services. And because of that experience and because of my job as a journalist, I just wanted to look into it more. It seemed like a really, this kind of glaring, really fundamental issue facing kind of my generation of new parents, gender equality. And I felt like as a as a two-dad family, we could offer a bit of a unique perspective on it, because what do you do without all those societal expectations, and the generational expectations on what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a dad? And we were just two adults trying to split it as equally as possible. And then also through my experience as a journalist, you know, I wanted to look into the science. And is it true that fundamentally dads can't be primary parents? Do mums really have this kind of special instinct, which means that's never going to happen? And if we want proper equality, is it possible? So I spoke to loads of experts and scientists and things like that. And the result is my book, The Equal Parent, which was out a couple of months ago. And yeah, the kind of big spoiler is absolutely no, there's no barriers. There's no fundamental reason that dads can't be properly equal parents. So absolutely, I believe that we should be striving for that.
And that's what I love, the way you kind of wove in your personal story and then some really solid research drawn from so many different places and lots of kind of personal stories. And like I said, I've probably spent a lot more time thinking about this than some people, and I learned so much from that book. So I'm really happy it inspired you to write it. Now,
and I want to pick up actually really quickly, if it's all right, on a comment's already come in from Daniel Adams about health visitor being really surprised to see him when going for a checkup. And that really reminds me of good friends of ours, a straight couple, Deborah and Paul, and they split, you know, often the discussions about workplaces, and, you know, they split parental leave. But actually when it was his portion of leave when they had one of their health checkups. And they had exactly experience like that, where, you know, they were treated with suspicion because he knew a lot more than she did about the schedule at that point, or about weaning. And, you know, part of this is what workplaces can do, but also it has to tie up with other services, because there's no point offering these great schemes if, like shared parental leave, if you're treated with suspicion by other parts of society when you take it.
You're actually also reminds me, like, another thing is about schools. So the last time I did one of these cross-company events was around Mental Health Week. And I remember a dad wrote in, I'm in a same-sex relationship. And at school, the class teacher actually had the audacity to say, well, which one of you's being like the mum? If there's a, you know, a problem, who should I call? It's like, yeah, it's not only like we're doing what we can in the workplace, but as you say, it's what's going on at home, it's what's going on in the health service, schools, etc.
And that really plays into that idea. You know, we look around society and we expect men to be proficient at work or whatever, and yet men are just routinely patronized when it comes to looking after their own children. So either you're praised, like, wow, we're seeing you doing this, or you're massively patronized, and the assumption is the only way you could do this if you kind of pretend to be a woman.
Well, my pet hate is like when women refer to their husbands or partners as babysitting. Like, how can you babysit your own child? Like, you're the parent. You wouldn't say a mother's babysitting a child, right?
Yeah, and you wouldn't do that to women at work. We've thankfully moved away from that. Like, oh, you playing at being at work, even though you're a woman. Thankfully, we've moved well away from that. And now the time has come for kind of the second half of the revolution of gender equality, which is to stop doing that to men at home.
So I'm going to ask you, I mean, we're going to chat anyway, a few questions, and we're going to have more general questions at the end. But what I really try and encourage in all of these sessions is for lots of chat on the side. So if I ask Paul a question and you'd like to contribute your own answer, please do that, because this is also a space to, you know, normalize common challenges, share experience, get our minds going. And I always learn from the audience. So we really invite you to contribute. It doesn't mean Paul and I can always read it while we're talking, but do share thoughts, chat amongst yourselves, and think about some questions at the end. So firstly, like, this concept of like parenting out loud has become quite a big catchphrase, whether that's in the workplace or more broadly. And I'm just interested to know, in like your own experience, did you face any barriers or challenges, whether, you know, colleagues at work or outside of work? And if so, how did you handle them?
Yeah, definitely. I do think now fundamentally the biggest barrier is myself. And I think lots of parents can probably relate to this. I think as a man at work, you can kind of pass as not being a parent quite easily, or not having that responsibility. And I massively felt the temptation at work. At first, when I came back, I split parental leave with my husband, and when I came back to not be seen to be leaving for parenting reasons, and to say things, you know, to have to leave the office at, let's say, 4:30 one day to pick up my son from nursery at 6, and then feel like an awful parent because he's been at nursery from 8 till 6, but feel like an awful employee because I'm leaving at 4:30, and kind of walking out and saying things like, oh yeah, no, I've got a meeting, I'll see you tomorrow. And more just wanting now to be really open about that and frank, and to exactly as you said, parent out loud at work. And I think part of the issue here is that women, when they become pregnant at work, there's no hiding it. You know, your body changes. So it's announced to all your colleagues and your employees very clearly that you're going to have this shift in responsibilities. You're also going to be caring for a baby soon. And the same thing doesn't happen to dads, but our lives do massively change. And, you know, society has massively changed. The expectation that dads aren't going to be around at all and are going to be back at work after 2 weeks and aren't going to be changing nappies and all those kind of things, that doesn't apply anymore. The role of being a dad has changed already. It needs to change more, but it's already changed. And so I do think there's a really big responsibility on men to kind of, because we don't have that physical change, to be loud about it at work, and particularly senior men at work, because you're setting the example for your younger colleagues that when they have children, if they want to have children, that they then know it will not be held against them when at 4:30 some days they have to leave early. And maybe they'll log on later. Maybe they'll make up the time another time.
Sometimes, sorry to interrupt, but with that, people say, well, they're in a much more senior role, so they can afford to work more flexibly and they don't have to worry as much about their career progression. So those role models in senior teams are really important, but we don't want it, you know, to come exclusively from there.
I guess I think it's just about setting that example. I think often in workplaces, you can have really well-intentioned HR emails, and they arrive on the floor in everyone's inboxes, and everyone, you know, often people can kind of roll their eyes and be like, yeah, that's the official company policy, but try telling that to my boss. And fundamentally, people have to know that their own bosses won't hold it against them if they have to take that time, or they have to work a bit more flexibly because they have this other responsibility. And crucially, that it's not just the women at work that have this responsibility, whether you're a man or a woman. And if you have a child, the expectation should be that your working patterns might have to change a little bit because you've got this huge other responsibility.
Yeah, I agree. And I think anyway, people are moving towards being more open about anything that's going on outside of work, you know, whether that's they've discovered they're neurodiverse, or they've got caring responsibilities, or perhaps mental health challenges. We're moving towards people just being more open, but I know some cultures at work, you still feel like,
well, that's why you can get the HR message, but it depends who your manager is, and it depends who your team is. And that's why I think as managers, it is really important to be loud about this stuff, and even more so for the men, because I do think that the most senior people at work often are men who didn't do this when they had children, they had a wife at home doing the stuff of parenting and the responsibility of parenting on a day-to-day basis. So I think there can be a temptation for them to look around the room and think, we've got to a good place with gender equality. Look at all these women at work, and I don't feel any personal prejudice. But I have this slight suspicion that those kind of bosses also have this kind of subconscious presumption that everyone has a wife at work. Everyone could be here till midnight tonight if they had to be, because everyone has a wife at work, at home, sorry. But obviously that's not the case. So yeah, I do think it's really important that men are also really clearly seen to be having that responsibility as well.
Totally. So you already touched on this in your introduction, but this concept of, you know, parental instinct as being something exclusive to mums. And you said you obviously can't give birth or breastfeed, but apart from that, there is literally no difference in a male or female's ability to parent. I mean, I was a school teacher, but I was absolutely clueless when I was presented with a newborn baby. You know, it's nothing to do with gender. It took me and my husband like 4 hands to do up one nappy the first time. And I think you touched on this as well in your book, that it's just that mums often feel more confident because they've got more practice and they're like thrown in at the deep end. So what, you share quite a lot around that in the book, and what we can do as individuals to challenge traditional stereotypes and these kind of societal expectations around parenting.
Well, there are a couple of findings in writing my book that I thought were really, really interesting and that I wanted to really amplify, because it really goes to the kind of crux of this. And over the past few decades, there's been really interesting science in this area to do with kind of mothers' instincts and if they exist and whether men can match them and all that kind of stuff. You know, fundamentally, biologically, can we be equal parents as dads? And the first thing is hormonal. They've like taken blood and measured hormone levels of new parents. And women do, through pregnancy and childbirth, get surges of oxytocin, which is the hormone that makes you bond. And there's also stuff to do with kind of stress hormones coming down when they hold their babies and things like that. And that, you know, there does seem to be a fundamental biological thing that happens to women through childbirth and pregnancy. However, over the past few decades, scientists have discovered that when dads are properly engaged, their oxytocin levels go up as well, but so high that they actually match new mothers. And so even though they haven't gone through pregnancy and childbirth, their hormones also change. Biologically, you are changed as a parent, whatever your sex is, as long as you're there. So absent dads don't get that hormonal change. But if you're a dad who's there and you're holding your baby to your chest and you have that time, and maybe you do bottle feeding or you're changing their nappies, you're just physically present and you're doing stuff, your brain changes, your hormones change. By holding your baby to your chest, those stress hormones come down just like they do in new mothers. So that's the first part of it, is hormonally, science has shown that men can be equal parents. They bond as intensely, kind of fatherhood is as fundamental and biological and as intense a bonding experience as motherhood, which surprises some people because there is this assumption that, you know, only mums get that bond. Not true. The other thing is to do with the amygdala, which is the back of the brain, and it's two parts, and they're to do with kind of alertness. And what scientists wanted to do is answer this question about why mums often wake up first at night. So often in straight couples, people say that the mum wakes up first. And that does seem to be true. And what scientists did was they scanned new parents' brains, new mums and new dads, and they found that crucial part of the brain to do with alertness was 4 times the size in new mothers. So actually there is a mother's instinct kind of biologically. However, more recently, they've done the same to 2 dad families through surrogacy, like me and my husband. And they found that whoever the primary carer is, their brains look like new mothers. The amygdala also is 4 times the size. And so what that shows is that actually it's not to do with sex. It's to do with being a primary parent. It's to do with taking responsibility. And it sounds really scientific, but actually all it is that feeling that you get if you've got like a presentation the next day or a speech or, you know, exam, and you feel really sweaty and you can't sleep, or you've got a flight in the morning and you can't sleep properly. And I think mums, it seems from this research, they feel that responsibility more deeply. They feel like they have to be the primary parent, and dads can't sleep a bit easier. However, if a mum's not there and it's 2 dads, lo and behold, the baby doesn't cry and no one goes to the baby. Like, you know, one of them gets up. And actually with us, that absolutely happened. When I was on parental leave, I woke up first. And I remember being furious with Robin, my husband, and kind of, there's nothing more maddening than your baby screaming and your partner is snoring in bed, and you think, how the hell are you sleeping through this? And I was furious, and I also was having these kind of existential crises, like, why am I turning into a new mum? Like, why is he still a man, but I've changed? And what does that mean? And actually, Robin took over parental leave for the second half of the year. We split it half-half. And whenever I say this anecdote, it sounds too perfect, but it is true. And I can't remember if it was that night or 2 nights later, whenever it was, but very soon after taking over the primary responsibility role, he woke me up in the middle of the night and said, I can't believe you didn't wake up, Solly was screaming. And then he started waking up first. And loads of couples like us that I've spoken to, exactly the same thing happened, straight and gay. That when they split parental leave, whoever's on parental leave feels that responsibility a bit more and wakes up first. But basically, all this, that is kind of to summarize the science, and I go into it in detail in the book, but it shows that biologically equal parenting is absolutely possible. Yes, women do naturally have these kind of maternal instincts, but dads are actually totally capable of them. They just have to be around and doing it. And you don't get that, you don't get that, or you're much less likely to get that if you have to be back at work in 2 weeks. So, it's really important that dads have that time to be with their babies.
And what I hear from a lot of dads, to be honest, is there's quite a lot of maternal gatekeeping going on. So, you know, even if they're left in sole charge of like long lists, or if, you know, a woman's traveling for work with, you know, food in the freezer and clothes laid out for each day and all these instructions. And, you know, do you think we will ever get to this stage where the role of a father is respected equally to that of a mother, and even women are not feeling like they have to, you know, spoon feed their partners?
I think it's really natural what happens, that if you're the parent that goes first, and almost always that's going to be the woman, the mother, and you have gone through those hard hours in the night and you've got used to your own techniques of getting them to sleep, and you've been in charge of the kind of routines and them trying to get them sleeping through the night. And then even if you go back to work after 6 months, it's really, really hard to then let go and think he's going to do it his own way. And what you want, you know, I'm a man, so I can't relate to lots of different aspects of being a mother. But because I went first, I definitely had that temptation as well. I used to, you know, I remember looking at my husband burping our son, and I'd be like, why are you doing it that way? Like, but you just have to remind yourself that they're not going to die. They're going to be fine.
Better than perfect.
Yeah, and I think it's really tempting at first to do things like pack the bag for them, because, you know, they're taking over, but I'm going to make sure he's remembered the nappies and he's remembered the cream. But actually, it's really, really important that dads as well as mums have those moments of forgetting the nappies, or packing the bag, or forgetting the bag at home, and you're at the park with your baby and they've done a poo and you don't have your bag. And you know what? Next time you won't do that again. But if someone else has packed the bag for you and put it on the front doorstep, you never feel that proper responsibility. And it's all to do with that science, to do with the amygdala and the part of the brain that's to do with alertness. Like, you have to feel that burn of responsibility. No one is going to do this apart from me. You know, that same man is perfectly capable of packing his bag for work, isn't he? And we know it would be ridiculous to leave him a list and say, make sure you have your suit dry cleaned and do this. He just does that stuff on his own because he's an adult and he can do it. And yet what happens is that the mothers often don't trust their partners fundamentally. But really, I think the key thing that I learned in writing this book and speaking to all the experts is that if you want to do this equally, you have to go away and leave them to it. And if they get some things wrong or do things differently to you, it doesn't matter. They'll be fine. And more than that, actually, it's the fundamental part of forming a really close bond is doing things your own way. And that's good for the mum, because she can then go off and be at work and not have to worry. Because one of my pet peeves is kind of when parents leave lists for the other parent, or you're out with someone for drink in the evening and they have to check their phone all the time and they're like, oh, my husband can't get him to sleep. It's like, they're not going to die. Leave your phone. Stop telling him what to do. He'll work it out. It's good for you. It's good for your partner. But also, what scientists have found is it's really good for babies, because it's actually really important to learn about empathy and to learn that different people are different. And even when they're so young, apparently they start to understand that different people are different by having this crucial one-on-one care from different people. So you're a newborn baby and somehow you're picking up that when mum changes my nappy, she plays this game on top of my head. And when dad does it, he tickles my tummy and he blows in my face. And they're two people doing it in different ways. And, you know, when mum gives me meals, she cuts up my chicken. And when dad does it, he puts a load of ketchup on the side, or whatever it is, you know, but you're learning that different people are different. And there's kind of loads of really good evidence that shows that for kids, it's amazing to have a few different stable attachment figures. So not just one, and they don't have to be parents. It could be a really good nanny. It could be mum and dad, or you could be a single parent family, but you have a grandparent that helps out a lot. And that's really good for kids. And it's also really reassuring for parents at work that actually the best thing for your kids is not that you're with them all the time, but actually that you do go off and they do have experiences being cared for by a few different really good caretakers.
Yeah, I really believe that. You're making me think about, like, also when you parent older kids, that you have to just stand back and let them make their mistakes and kind of keep quiet. It's the same kind of thing, like, oh, they've missed their dentist appointment, don't just call them up. If they're 20 years old, that's their responsibility, and you know, they might have to pay for it, because it's just allowing them to make. It's
the same at work, isn't it? If you're a manager at work and you you're really, really, on top of your employees because you don't want them to make mistakes, they never fundamentally learn and progress. Like, you do have to learn as a manager to let people grow as employees. And it's kind of similar in that relationship.
Yeah. There's a comment there about, is this our own gender stereotyping? Mum's cutting the chicken so the baby doesn't get choked and dad's putting on the ketchup.
That's probably my subconscious bias. Although, frankly, I've got no problem with ketchup. Apparently, it's very good for people drinking ketchup because of the intensity of the tomatoes. So there, I'm not seeing that as a bad thing.
No, she was joking anyway, Catherine. Thank you. So, let's talk a little bit more about the workplace, because so many people dialing in are working with large organisations. So what do you think? I mean, I've worked with News UK, so I know they're really supportive and they have incredible initiatives. But what is the one big shift? Like, if you can't do everything at once, that an employer or business could make that will drive. I mean, so much of it is about culture. It's not just, policies and things that they do. And we've already mentioned about the utmost thing is your direct line manager. So whatever it says on the tin, the person that you have to, really engage with all the time doesn't get it. It's very, very difficult. But what's like one or two really practical things that organizations can do to drive an authentic shift in attitude and mindset with regards to, the role of dads and everything we'll be speaking about?
I think it does start with policy. So, like, just having an equal parental leave policy, and one that doesn't require dads to take their portion at the beginning. Often you have policies where it's equal, but that means that the dads can only take it at the beginning. But I think and allowing dads or partners to take parental leave in the second half of the year is really, really important, because, it's tempting to take extended leave as a dad if that's offered by your workplace when your partner's also off. And that might be really nice, but what often happens in that situation is the dad, as much as they're doing at home, they're still not the primary parent. They're still a helper to the mum who's already off. And actually, independent parental leave is really, really important, because that's where you form your own sense of deep responsibility and being a primary parent, and not having to call all the time to find out what you need to do. Now, I get really frustrated when I hear dads say things like, or you hear them asking their wives things like, okay, do I have to cut up the grapes? Or, and it's like, why don't you know this stuff? So actually having independent leave, I think, is really, really important. So a policy that's equal and also flexible enough that allows parents to properly split the leave and not necessarily to be off together. You can be off together if you want, but allowing that independence. And then the other thing I think that sometimes we can get wrong at work is when everything is marketed to parents. And whilst that it's gender neutral and it sounds equal, I do think in this area, sometimes we really need to speak to dads directly. And there is some research, for instance, from the NHS that shows that if you write letters after the birth of a baby to parents or to the mum, dads don't show up at the appointments. But if you explicitly say mum and dad, if you explicitly address the dads are, I can't remember the figure, but way, way, way more likely to show up. And so at work, if we're saying we have these initiatives for parents, often I think men just kind of don't fundamentally feel that applies to them, and mums go. I often end up speaking to a room full of mums on these issues. But if you directly address dads, like in this type, when you look at the poll, it's actually a perfect example of equal parenting. It's an equal split of mums and dads. But that is actually really unusual. And I think that's partly because it's a Father's Day thing, so you've addressed dads. So I do think that's really, really important that we do that when possible.
Yeah. We
have to explicitly say to men, there's this leave that's an equal policy, but you can really take this. Because also there's research from the government that shows that men's requests for flexible working are more likely to be rejected after having kids.
Yeah, there was a question about that a bit earlier on. I happened to see someone asking, they've only, I've lost it. There's so much activity, I can't find where it was, but someone's saying they've only met ever one or two people, dads that work flexibly. I've lost it.
Exactly. Firstly, I want to quickly just pick up. Alison has made a really good point, and I'm really sorry. Absolutely, I mean to dads and partners. Because she was saying that she didn't give birth. Same as I'm not genetically related to my son. I, took that time off work and I'm his dad, but we had him through surrogacy and it wasn't my sperm that we used. Similarly, I absolutely mean any partner. Couldn't care less what your gender is. Fundamentally, it's just, you don't have to have given birth to be the person that is always expected to be looking after your kid.
And now when you were saying about letters, I'm just starting to think, you might not have experienced this yet with Solly because he hasn't started school, but these beautiful WhatsApp groups, if I think, I've still got 2 school-age children, and I don't think there are any dads on the WhatsApp, the school WhatsApp groups. And a lot of people say things about that as well, so they don't know about when they have to do whatever it is they have to do for school or birthday parties or.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, and often the groups are kind of for mums. And you know what, I do think that if we really want equality, and it's all about that, like, do we want equality? And if we do, then we have to invite dads. Dads should be expected to be at the appointments. They should also be expected to be at the play groups. And to give dads credit, lots has changed already. I think often we can address this subject and assume dads are the same as our dad's generation of dads, and actually that's not true. It was quite common a generation ago for dads to openly say they didn't change nappies. Like, if you were at a dinner party and a dad turned around and said, "Oh, I don't change nappies," I think everyone would rightly now.
At the birth. I mean, it starts.
And they wouldn't be at the birth. But again, if someone turned around and said, "Oh, yeah, no, my wife's giving birth next week, but I'm not going to go," I think everyone would rightly judge them negatively. That has just naturally changed in a generation, which is really promising. Dads are doing a lot more. You go to a soft play centre on a Saturday and there will be loads of dads there. And, that's all great. But I think particularly at the beginning of life with the baby groups and stuff like that, and then also schools, and people often talk about this, there's a kind of year 4 evening about kind of maths or something, and it's a room full of mums. But, dads have to go to those as well if we want equality.
So there's a massive shift in what dads are doing. I even see it especially with my youngest brother, who's such a hands-on dad. But there was a lot in the press. Obviously, COVID pushed us all to practice flexible working and working from home, and everyone's got that taste of being able to pick up their kids from school and have dinner with them and then log on back to work. But there was a lot in the press about mothers still doing more of the housework, more of the childcare, taking on that main burden of the mental load, which again, probably your research shows it's all about taking that responsibility. But from speaking to quite a lot of same-sex couples, I do get the impression that they feel more free from that kind of provider, father, caregiving, mother expectation. So what do you think heterosexual couples, or any couples, saying that, I did meet someone in a same-sex relationship at Amazon who was saying they got home and it can happen anywhere, but how can we address that division of labour in the home? If anyone's sitting here thinking, "Oh, I just wish my partner would do more," how can we, or I know you've really managed to navigate this in a brilliant way with Robin, like sharing the load in a way that feels authentic, that is drawing on each of your strengths. It's not like, well, I spent 2 hours doing this yesterday, so now you've got to spend 2 hours, doing the same thing, all this kind of blocking off against each other. How do we manage that at home?
Well, I think one thing to reflect on that might be useful is, literally saying to yourself, if we were 2 men, what would we do? So I think there can often be a temptation, like this happens after parental leave. Women often say, "I didn't go back to work because my salary didn't cover the childcare fees." Or men will say, "Yeah, my wife didn't go back to work because her salary it wasn't worth her going back to work because of the childcare fees." But actually, why are we only looking at hers? With me and Robin, just because we're 2 men, we never thought only one of us would make that sacrifice. It wouldn't have mattered if our salaries were very different. We'd have always thought, what do we bring in together? How much is childcare fees? If we had to make sacrifices, we both would have gone down a bit. I think when it's a man and a woman, there's always assumption that the woman's job gets sacrificed. And then on a day-to-day basis, I think often, I've had this conversation with friends where the woman will be working more flexibly now, but he'll say, "Oh, my boss doesn't like it when I leave early, so I can't." And you think, if you were a woman, you would leave early. And so, you know, what would, if we were the same sex, would we make the same decision? You know, because when you are a same-sex couple, I think you can just take away all those societal pressures and the expectation of what it means to be a mother and guilt around being a mother, all those kind of things, and just think, we're two adults, we've got a big responsibility. Anything other than sharing this responsibility is totally unfair. So how are we going to share it? The other thing is exactly what you said, like I think before having Solly, we definitely would have assumed that we'd have done 50-50 of everything, and we don't. It's an ongoing conversation and an ongoing argument. We have arguments about this. You know, we've both got a really important meeting tomorrow. Who sacrifices it? And, you know, what we've worked out is that we both have to make sacrifices. And sometimes Robin has a really intense period at work, and I just have to be brave enough to say to my boss and to my employees, I'm working from home much more this week. And equally the other way around, there are times that he has to step up at home. And I guess like any relationship, you have to be open about it, but we're definitely not perfect. And it's kind of an ongoing conversation. But fundamentally, I think you should always be aiming for it to be fair. And so many women do talk about the mental load and how, you know, even though the kids are much older, they're the one that carries it. So I think in terms of that, it's the same as before. The one thing that massively, massively has made a difference to me is just leaving, just buggering off sometimes. You know, I think it is incredibly freeing to leave that mental load if you can, and just trust them, and also not beat yourself up if they do it differently. And you know what, going on the commute to work and not having the responsibility of childcare is amazingly freeing. But you can't still be micromanaging in order to feel that freedom.
That's true. There's so much going on the side that I kind of want to read and address. So we know that changing cultures it's hard, deep work, ongoing conversations, engaging people, holding people to account where you kind of see them modeling things poorly. And we all do have the power in our own way to kind of change that, whether it's in the workplace or at home. And it does kind of start with you and your own family. Everyone can do their own bit. So is there anything else you desperately kind of thought, I just wanted to say this and I hadn't asked the question, before we open up a bit more to the audience and get some of their questions?
Yeah, maybe it's just reinforcing that last point. Is like, I do think there can be a temptation to do everything together or do everything kind of in an obviously equal way. And I think more, you just have to leave sometimes. And actually, the one thing I really want to say is that so much about the conversation about parenting at work can be negative and about sacrifices and about, oh, now you have to work flexibly and you don't have, how many hours are there in the day, and there's so much to do with parenting. But I think actually there is huge value in parents at work, and actually becoming a parent can make you really, really good at your job. And I think I'm so much less nervous about things now than I was 3 years ago. I don't overthink as much. I've done things at work that would have kept me up at night. And you know what? There was so much to do the night before with Solly and with other stuff that I barely had time to think about it. And you might have to work more flexibly. And sometimes the conversation now is all about working from home. But it's not about working from home, it's about working flexibly. So yes, you might have to be in the office that day, but you might have to leave at 4:30. And maybe you haven't finished everything, so you log on later. Or maybe because you're a parent and because you've got so much to do, you're more efficient now, and so you get it all done by 4:30. And so, you know, I feel huge power in being a parent at work. I see huge value in the parents around me at work, because I think, you know, what better experience is there of project managing, of getting stuff done? I had no appreciation before becoming a parent of the fact that my colleagues who were parents were stepping in that door in the office and they'd already had like 25 negotiations they'd had that morning over which shoes to wear and how to get in the car and what snack to have. And you get through that, and I think there are huge positives for workplaces as well.
Yeah,
and that's not talked about enough.
I tell you, I'm really happy you remembered to say that, because it does bring so many transferable skills. A few weeks ago, I wrote a new talk for a construction company. They're a global company that had the focus on, like, the theme was listening and empathy. So they said, can you do a talk on the parallels between parenting and leadership? And when I focused on it for a whole hour, there was just so much. I'm not just saying that because I'm also a parent. I mean, it honestly made me so much better at my work for so many different reasons.
And I don't know if other people can relate to the kind of anxiety thing, or that's just a personal experience I've had. But I do feel like I'm freed from anxiety.
Yeah, you just
because I used to have hours and hours overnight to think about things, and there's only so much you can worry about. There's a kind of limited capacity for anxiety, and that does free you to perform better, I think.
Yeah, and we also know that when you're a parent, I mean, lots of things are out of our control anyway, but kids, you know, things happen on the spur of the moment, and you don't have that same sense of control that you did when you only were responsible for yourself. So we just kind of learn to navigate change and transitions, and like, you're supposed to do this massive meeting and then actually your child's ill and you've got to take them to the doctor instead, and we're just constantly having to adjust quickly, which you know, improves our capacity at work. So please ask some questions. There's one really good point that I want to start with. I have to find it again, about somebody saying now where is it? Somebody's saying something about older children. Oh, it looks like maybe it's disappeared. But the fact that we focused quite a lot on talking about babies, and obviously, Paul, your experiences with a young child. I've now got 2 adult children. And the thing that also workplaces don't always recognise, and I always say this as well, we focus a lot on, you know, we do lots of transition coaching workshops for people who've just had a baby and come back from leave. And then you think after a few years, well, they've got that parenting thing sorted. But obviously what happens, I've got one child going through GCSEs. There are different phases in a child's life, teenage years, mental health challenges, all sorts of stuff that actually, although they don't need you, you know, they're more independent physically, they can take up a lot more of your time. And we need to remember that for old parents of older children as well, we can't think that they've got everything now sorted. So Ed, thank you for making that point. I also agree, it does get harder as they grow up, Paul, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, I don't want to hear that.
Sorry. Anyone got, because there's loads of chat and all of you talking amongst yourselves, anyone got like a specific question that you want to ask either Paul or myself? I don't know if you can start reading, Paul, and find some things, or maybe if you put it as a specific question in the Q&A.
I'm just reading that last point from Jacqueline about how it's good to know that things are changing. I think something that's really powerful is that kind of activism or changing things doesn't always have to come from like a huge policy change and stuff like that. Sometimes just existing and living life how you want to do it, and being loud and proud about that, has a huge impact on the people around you. And, you know, people say that a kind of, there have been lots of like political issues, for instance, about education about same-sex parents at school and whether it's appropriate for primary schools. Now, protests in Birmingham. And I kind of find that hilarious, because everyone who goes to school, who goes to nursery with my son and another set of twins at his nursery who have 2 mums, knows that some kids have two same-sex parents. And they know that some kids just have one active parent, because that's what they see. They see single parent households, and there is a power in that changing. And similarly, if you are the only man at a mum and toddler group, and someone made a comment about that, how their partner's often the only man there, amazing, keep going. Like, it's only by being there that you don't know the effect that has on the other women who are there, who then go home to their partners and say, oh, there's a dad there, why don't you come? So just kind of living authentically and being loud about it is really powerful as well.
Yeah, there's a question that comes up quite a lot. I get asked about navigating a boss who has no children and less empathy. I do have to say something on that, and again, that's our stereotypes that I've heard women say. Like, I heard some woman who was working on a trading floor in a very senior position and got headhunted to work somewhere else, and she met the person she'd be working for, who was a mother with 3 kids, but because she hadn't had any kind of special treatment as a mother, she would have rather worked for her existing boss, who was a 30-year-old guy with no kids. She found him to be more empathetic and give her that autonomy and flexibility than another parent. So very often it can be that the boss or the lead, the line manager hasn't been a parent, but not always. It's just about their views on things. But how do we kind of navigate? Because it, like we said, it's that relationship with the line manager that's so key.
I think that is where it's really tricky, and that's where you have that disconnect. And I know there are some HR people on the call, and it does start with HR and having the official policies, but it kind of, it has to be seen on the floor as well, irrelevant who your manager is. So that is really, really tricky. And I also have heard the other point you made, Rachel. I've heard that before, how often if a woman in a very senior position is a mother and she didn't get these allowances, she wasn't treated well. She was expected just to be there all hours of the day and wasn't. Often they can be very difficult bosses in these situations as well, because they didn't do it this way.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit resentful, like, well, what is this new way? Like, I managed, why can't you just?
Yeah, exactly. I didn't get to leave at 4:30. So that is, I'm not offering any solutions, to be honest. I'm just kind of acknowledging.
Any challenge, it's about just having open conversations. And the other thing is, for parents, don't just come and go along and say, I want this and I want that, but really think it from a business perspective as well, and make a suggestion like, I understand that this and this is maybe a bit tricky for you, but if we could approach it in this way, I believe that the business can also benefit because of this, or like come with a solution rather than just like a problem and saying I need X, Y, and Z, but like to show that you've also taken on board their perspective and how it could work for them as well. There is something as well, there's a bit of chat about shared parental leave, and this is like an old ongoing question, that even when it is available and even if it's paid for, dads are worried about all the things that women are worried about, is their career progression and how they're going to be perceived by colleagues, like you're having a holiday. We love that, don't we, when people say taking leave with a child is like having a break. Or
well, I think shared parental leave has been proved not to work, and it seems it's one of these examples where something seems equal in theory, but it doesn't work. And when you look at other countries, for instance, like in Sweden, they used to have a shared parental policy like there is in the UK, and it didn't work. Uptake among men wasn't very big, and they switched to what's called a use it or lose it system, when there's an allocation for mums and an allocation for partners. And suddenly now dads take 30% of all parental leave. And it does start with that, with the earliest years. Similarly, in Iceland, 30 years ago, dads took no parental leave, basically. And now they've got a use it or lose it policy. And again, dads take 30% of all leave now. And that's like an unbelievable change when you think about it in just 30 years. Like, babies didn't used to have that time with their dads directly caring for them. And now almost a third of all babies have that. So yeah, I don't think shared parental leave works. I think you have to have an allocation for a mother and an allocation for a partner, or an allocation for, going first or second, irrelevant of your sex or sexuality. And I also saw another comment, like often it's offered, but the terms aren't as good if you go later in the year. And that just can't be the case if we and it all comes back to this point, like, do we genuinely want equality? And do we genuinely want women to be back at work? Because what happens, we know that women take most of the first year off, and then they're more likely to cut down their hours once their kids are at school. And then lo and behold, in 10 years' time, they're out of the workforce. But actually, there's been amazing studies, like for instance, in Canada, in Quebec, they had an amazing childcare policy where it was $10 a day. And so many women went back to work because of it, that it more than paid for itself in the economy. And that was so conclusive that now across the whole of Canada, they've got this amazing policy, because good childcare paid for by the state allows so many more parents, and in particular women, to go back to work, that it's actually the best, it's not just the right thing to do. Economically, at the moment, what we're doing in the UK is stupid, because so many more, we have to support new parents, because actually getting them back to work is really good for the economy as well. And so, at the moment, society's expectations are so ingrained that we make illogical financial decisions as well. So really, the key to those, policy-wise, the key is use it or lose it, parental leave rather than shared parental leave, and really good childcare policies that get parents back to work.
Yeah. There's a question about whether there's more equal parenting is implemented more across financial services or other industries. I think, I spend a lot of time, not a lot, but I try to spend like 20 minutes a day on LinkedIn or something, having a look at the latest thing. And, people are always sharing, like, this company's done this, and it doesn't feel like it's one particular sector or industry. I know when I started out in 2001 and I just started to call a few companies, some of the banks were literally the only sector where they already had a family network, which was very forward thinking. It's probably because they work the craziest hours as well, like in investment banking. But I don't know what your view is, if one industry seems to be.
Yeah, I think there is an issue, and often actually workplaces, and particularly in the city, are doing much better than society as a whole. And so you have this kind of two-tier system where if you walk around like parks in posh areas of London, you do see more dads because they are able to take parental leave, but the government's policy is so rubbish that if there's like a two-tier policy, if you happen to work for a really impressive financial firm, you're much more likely to have that opportunity than if you're working in a factory in Bolton. And so actually, I think the government has been quite smart over the past few decades to shift the onus onto companies to offer really good policies, where actually government statutory parental leave is a disgrace and it pays at half the rate of minimum wage, and it doesn't work. So really, in some ways, credit should go to companies because they are doing much better, but the government needs to take a huge, much more responsibility as well.
Absolutely. So anybody else got like a burning question or something that a thought that you want to share, or something that you've seen work really well where you are? I mean, we are all personally responsible. I don't know, it's also really interesting, we've had, when we have discussions like this, for people to share even what is their main takeaway, like having heard Paul sharing so many different practical ideas and experiences. What is like one shift or one conversation or one like shift in your own mind that you can make, like your main takeaway as a result of this conversation? And Paul's asked again if we can implement use it or lose it in the UK. Well,
the government policy at the moment is shared parental leave, so that needs to change, and it should be use it or lose it. And someone else previously made a comment about a company offering the leave spread a bit longer than the first year. And that can be really, really important as well, because it doesn't really have to be in the first year, but the key kind of when it comes to biology and things like that, and we talk about the mental load later with older kids, but it all starts at the earliest point, and the key does seem to be having independent leave as a parent. So not having the other parent watching over you or leaving a list, or having the opportunity to really learn and do it your own way. And so that that's where it is really important that however we do it, that dads or partners also get the opportunity to be off by themselves. And Rachel, you kind of started with this, but partly what happens is you have a baby, and this is what the experts say, that you have a baby and neither of you really know what you're doing. But the mum has much more opportunity because she's around. So she goes through those really, really tough times and forms her own ways. And then lo and behold, 6 months later, she says, oh, I have to be there because I'm the only one that can get him to bed. And my husband tries, but he can't. But if you just weren't there, the kid would go to sleep. It might be really hard for your partner, but they'd form their own ways of doing it as well. And, that is really, really the key here to everything, which is both any parent having that opportunity to have independent time, having proper primary responsibility for their kid.
I mean, I do a lot of I've got an online parenting course, and I do lots of one-to-one consultations. And I recently had a mum reach out, which I have quite a lot of, like, my son only wants his dad. He only wants his dad to like read him a book when he goes to bed and to put him to sleep and to prepare his breakfast, and she feels quite frustrated because she's more present than he is, and she's like, I'm doing all this stuff, and then he walks in and it's like he's hanging on every word, and how do I navigate this? And I just think that, like you were saying, everyone has different ways of doing, whether you're in a same-sex relationship, different, whether it's a mum or a dad involved in looking after a child, a grandparent, a neighbor, a godparent, a cousin, whoever it is, we all contribute in different ways. And it's about us thinking what our own personal strengths, like what can we contribute, what if we've got a hobby or an interest, or we all approach things differently, we all communicate differently. And I just think it's important for kids to kind of have that exposure to all sorts of.
But also, I really wonder, does that happen because you're both at home at the same time? What I mean by that is we've had this experience, and it ties into something. There's another comment from Ben Hayes that I'll come to. We've had this experience where often our Solly kind of wants me at bedtime, and if we're both at home and I'm downstairs, he'll come to the top of the stairs and he'll shout for me and all that kind of stuff. When I'm in the office, he doesn't do that, and Robin doesn't have an issue. And this is what I mean about sometimes not being there. And that sounds extreme, but like, go do the food shop, like get out of the other person's hair, because actually kids do that. They're messing around. They, sometimes it's just like almost an instinctive thing. Like my son now, he calls us Daddy Robin and Daddy Paulie. And so he'll sometimes when I'm with him say, I want Daddy Paulie. I'm like, I am him, sometimes. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes kids do that, and if you're downstairs and within earshot, it happens more. But if you're not there, it doesn't happen. And coming to what Ben said, is he said with the first child, his wife was office-based and he split leave. And the second child, his wife was working from home, and it was a completely different experience because of proximity. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but what I think he means there is maybe it was harder for him with the second child to be left alone to do it his own way. And the intention will always be good. There's I don't mean to criticize mothers who do that, but I can do it as well. And actually sometimes the best thing you can be is just to be aware. And that's as a work, in terms of work as well. If then when you're away or when you're in the office and you're not checking in or not feeling like you have to check in, that is a brilliant thing for work as well. So like you both have to sacrifice a bit and you both benefit a bit if you're kind of leaving each other to it whenever you can.
And obviously I want to just put a big shout out and acknowledge that there are a number of single parents on here as well that don't always have that opportunity to just let go and pass it to someone else. But it's really interesting, because this is where the scientific research is really reassuring as well. Doesn't matter what your genetics are. Like there's been studies, longitudinal studies over many decades into all different type of family setups that are coming back now. And they're showing that same-sex couples, single parents, for instance, same-sex couples through surrogacy, outcomes for children are as good as anyone else, if not better in some ways, but there's complicated reasons because it's expensive to have a kid, so you're more likely to be in financial security and stuff like that. But essentially what it's all proving now is you don't have to be, if you're an adoptive parent, it's not about genes, it's not about sex, it's about the verb of parenting, doing it. It's about what you do. And so that's really reassuring. And also that kind of point about single parents, like everyone has to share it to an extent. It doesn't have to be a partner. Maybe you've got a really good nanny and you leave them to it sometimes. Or maybe it's a grandparent, or, our support system doesn't have to be a partner. So I think hopefully in my book, the kind of in telling the story of the research as a journalist, it should be really reassuring for parents at work, whatever your situation at home. Yeah, thank you. So everyone, I am going to take a whole copy of the chat. I will remove the names, but there is so many brilliant ideas, juicy content. I saw something about there's some tests to see who's got most of the mental load. I mean, I can't wait to read through this. So I'm going to share it with everyone. I'm going to share a recording. So please feel free, if you've got people at work or your partners or whoever that you think can benefit from listening to this conversation. And I know one of the things I took away from your book and something I'm a massive advocate for is nothing to do with gender. It's just the way you parent. And I am all about giving parents the tools to really build that strong relationship and connection. Don't worry about the academics and all the extracurricular activity. That is the most important thing, to give your child the tools to succeed in life. So there's lots of content on my website with various blogs and things about all of that, and my online parenting course. But thank you so much as ever to the audience for your incredible contribution and interacting. And that's why I actually love this format, because when you are just sitting in a big auditorium, you can't actually know what everyone else is thinking. So thank you, everybody. And Paul,
can I say one small thing, which a couple of times in the comments and in discussions, it's come up about being a hands-on dad. And I think what we should be aiming for is for that to be a completely obsolete term, because it shouldn't even be surprising. Like, no one would ever call a mum a hands-on mum. And that's you know, that's something I think, you know, if we're looking at a bar, if we get to a point where dads are just expect, and you should just expect dads to be doing this fundamentally, and let's get to a point where that's not even like a means of praise, because it's just a total basic assumption that men are doing it as much as women.
Yeah, we've really got to think consciously about the language we use. But
yeah, I mean, it's not having a go at people who use that. It's only well intentioned. It's just sometimes it's good to have like a markers of you know, where we could get to hopefully at some point.
Well, I'm hoping, I say 80% of parenting is modelling. If our generation of parents are, you know, modelling equally all of this, that in a couple of generations we won't have these same stereotypes existing, and we will really get to that stage of being equal parents. But your book, if you haven't read it, really helps to get those arguments across, because it's all here in the research, right? So thank you, Paul.
My pleasure, and thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. I just paused.